So one of the most annoying things about talking about the FF7 Remake series outside of the community is that people who really haven't played these games make a lot of the same kind of strange assumptions about how these games necessarily work. The 7 Remake trilogy is very weird because they're individual JRPG sequels kind of akin to Kingdom Hearts, that they are parts or acts of a whole story that contain 3 separate video games inside of it. Now, I have seen some people online suggest that, hey, when this remake trilogy is over, why don't they just combine it all into a singular game, 120 plus hour main story at bare minimum. Now, this idea is just kind of inherently ludicrous. I mean, it definitely gives off that energy of people who want a Pokemon game with every single region in it. However, I think the idea of combining all 3 of these games into one singular massive game is not as like reality denying levels of impossible as you might think. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the idea of combining all of the FF7 Remake trilogy into one singular game.
All right, also just a heads up, I forgot to say this in the A-roll, but spoilers beware for everything FF7 related.
Now, the first thing that I might be thinking is, hey, isn't this really early to make this video? Shouldn't you be waiting for part 3 to be out before we even talk about this idea? Well, I'm impatient. But also, I think that the 2 data points that we have is already kind of enough. Now, what would be the main advantages on the consumer end for us for wanting to combine all of these games into one thing? Well, the first obvious thing is that it would bring Remake and Rebirth both in quality up to the standards of Part 3. It's not to say that they couldn't do that with just a normal remaster, but this combined approach would force that to happen. That would be a baseline expectation. And the other benefit, and I really think this is the main draw, people really want a complete narrative of FF7 Remake. It was 1 game before, it's 3 games now. Wouldn't it be cool if it was 3 games combined into 1 game? To me, why I'm even interested slightly in the idea of combining all these games together is being able to access all of the endgame content together. I would love to like fight Weiss with all the tools that you have in Rebirth and just make him absolutely cry. And it would make that fight just so hilariously like easy and stupid. The first immediate problem that I thought of when combining all these games would be how you would handle like the narrative transition between game to game. See, Remake and Rebirth are both designed with end credit sequences in mind. The ending CG cinematics both have songs that transition into the credits, and you're supposed to let it emotionally wash over you. That you're just supposed to sort of sit and like think about the experience that you had just played. But without the credits there for you to sit and absorb it, that's a big part of the experience of both games. Also, you would have to work around the individual title drops if it's just one individual game. I think about that one shot where Zack and Cloud are walking towards Midgar, and then it's specifically framed so you can have the Rebirth title drop. But if you just remove the logo but kept the same shot framing, it's just a weirdly framed shot that lingers for a long time. Also, I think there's like a non-zero chance that part 3 might open on what actually happened at the Forgotten Capital. And so having that butt up like right against like just seeing all that stuff transpire, when it's stitched together, it's gonna be way more awkward. Now, if Square Enix can solve the music transitioning into the credits deal, then I actually think that the transition between Remake and Rebirth actually is pretty natural thanks to the added scenes at the end of Intergrade of mainly the party walking over to Calm and stuff. That it would be like a nice relief, like after you had just fought Sephiroth, that you watch a bunch of cutscenes before you go and do the Nibelheim flashback stuff.
You know, actually, I was messing with an edit for transitions between Remake and Rebirth while I was editing this video, and actually kind of came up with something that I really, really like.
Gonna be okay?
Should be, but weird. My stomach's in knots.
That's its way of telling you it's hungry. Let's move.
I'm here on the Midgar Expressway. The scene is indescribable. Countless buildings have been leveled, and part of the road has collapsed.
Unfortunately, I think there's two intergrade scenes that don't work with the transition. One being like the Yuffie scene where she's on the chocobo. It just kind of feels redundant because we're gonna meet her later anyways. And then that Zack scene where he goes into the church because it's not the same Zack as the one we follow in Rebirth. And it's like a tease. We're gonna jump into Zack in like a couple seconds anyways. Now, by far the cinematic problem is the easiest one to solve. When it comes to anything gameplay related, progression, balancing, overall combat, just total nightmare. See, since each of these games are individual experiences, you really don't have to worry about any sort of overlap. That Rebirth can have you start from the beginning, and it doesn't really matter. As long as you are more powerful by the end, you do feel a sense of progression from game to game to game. But when you start combining all of these games together, then that becomes a problem, because then it's like, okay, well, the early parts of Rebirth, you really don't have that many tools on a first playthrough on the lower difficulties. And by the end of Remake, you have like a ton of things that you can mess with. Like, how do you reconcile that? This can be most obviously seen by the leveling system. I mean, Remake takes you from level 1 to 50, Rebirth you start at level 20, you go to 70, and I presume Part 3 is going to have a level cap of like 99 or 100 or something. So each of these games have like a 50 level progression, but when you put them back to back, it's gonna be really awkward, because then it's like, okay, I'm gonna have to condense this down into like 100 levels, and that would be really awkward and stuff. Well, okay, maybe you can then just make the level cap 150 and just keep that level of progression across each of the individual games. But then that starts causing more problems, because not every player that beat Remake ended up at level 50. So then you just have like this massive ceiling of levels way above you if you're not doing all of like the grinding and stuff to get to the max level cap of the portion of the game. Oh, and speaking of leveling up, material leveling in this theoretical game would become an absolute nightmare. See, these 7 Remake games already kind of get clowned on a little bit for the materia being so obscenely slow to leveling up on a first playthrough. And once you beat the game, it only starts to become like somewhat tolerable given the basic speed increase that you get, but some would argue that even that's still too slow. Now imagine that you are playing across 120 hours and the game wants you to slowly feel like you're getting more powerful. How glacially slow leveling up those materia would be. It would be a total nightmare. Imagine playing the entirety of FF7 Remake with just fire, and then at some point in Rebirth, it turns into Fyra. I guess one solution would be that you would just have your materia level up at like the individual game speed. So you could theoretically have like Fyraga by the end of Remake, beginning of Rebirth, and then just have it like stop progressing. And so it's not like annoying to level up, and you can just have people focus on like other materia to level up instead. But that would really take away a lot of the feeling of the progression of JRPGs. Although interestingly enough, this would make the level boost materia in Rebirth become obscenely more valuable than it currently is. That if you're taking an entire stretch of 3 games to level up your materia to do Fyragas, the level boost materia being able to boost your spells 1 tier will become absolutely invaluable. And talking about equipable items in general, what about all of like the unique items that are duplicated across each game, right? Things like the Magnify materia. Think about the limit necklace that you can get a limit break upon starting battle and stuff that are in both. Like, you clearly cannot just have multiples of these things just laying around that you could just stock up on them, and then that's gonna totally break the game in an entirely different way. So, okay, you could just remove all the duplicates and just have the ones in part 3 available. Well, then that starts causing other problems, because these items are specifically rewards for completing side quests or going out of your way to areas, and so you have to replace them with something else meaningful, or else what's the point of doing that side content in general? But then that starts coming into new problems, because then it's like, okay, like, are you gonna have to create brand new rewards for these things, brand new items, or you're just going to like start having to shuffle things around from other parts in the game into these other spots then? I guess the easiest solution to this would to be just taking Chadley's materia that he develops for you and then just dispersing it across the game to fill in the gaps there. which I guess, I don't know, is a solution. People hate Chadleys. Then it kind of starts causing a bunch of other cascading problems. Chadley, at least in Rebirth, is really critical in like incentivizing players to doing world exploration stuff. Like part of the reason why you even go out and explore the world in Rebirth is so you can come back to Chadley in order to get materia. And so all of these systems are very delicately tied into each other. So you really can't take stuff away from Chadley to then start like disincentivizing players from engaging with certain mechanics or features of the game in the first place in order to plug a hole that you've ended up creating for yourself by getting rid of all the duplicate rewards. Also, how exactly are weapons even going to work in this game? Because the abilities tied to the weapons also have their own sense of progression tied to them. So if you have like the ability to grab something like True Strike a third of the way through this massive game, and then you only gain like a handful more abilities through the remaining 2/3, then that's gonna really mess with the feeling of power creep. Really, the only way I've been able to solve the weapon progression problem personally is that you just have like weapons on like the main story progression that you really cannot miss, that will guarantee you like being able to get that item by a certain point. So say like by the end of part 3, you are 100% guaranteed that you're gonna get True Strike. You're not gonna miss that item, but you can go maybe out of your way to like go and find some of these abilities early or something by doing a side quest or something. And then, oh hey, I got this thing early, I can mess with it in combat and stuff. Reduces the amount of like redundancy if they're all in different spots across this extremely long game, while not really trying to cut out like people who just are focused on the main story. But then that proposal I came up with does have its own problems, because if you were to just leave the items within their own game but then just hide it really, really deep, Remake does not really have that deep of side content. So hiding True Strike in like a side quest or a combat challenge might not be maybe all that hard of a thing. Although now that I think about it, you can maybe hide True Strike behind Weiss, and I actually think that might be like a good reward. But then if you hide it in like the end game content, like if you have to beat Weiss to get the True Strike gloves, then that kind of makes going back to Weiss, like after you've played the entire time without taking on that content as you go, like really defeating. It's like, I already have like the True Strike gloves. Why do I need another set of gloves? Now, I guess the way that you can solve the overlapping redundant weapon problem is that even if you have like the same abilities tied to multiple different weapons, you could make them unique from each other, so that way they fulfill specific niches and they encourage people to experiment and mess with different builds. Do sort of like a Monster Hunter weapon type thing. But the problem with that model is that Monster Hunter is really built around that there's so many different like levers and sliders and stuff just with the individual weapons, like different gem slots that they can have, what sharpness that they have, and like the characteristics of the sharpness drop off, the base attack stat that they have, maybe even unique abilities tied to that weapon. Those are all factors that in the Monster Hunter games make weapons all feel unique from each other. Really, a lot of the time with the 7 Remake weapons, it all kind of comes down to like what breakdowns of stats really kind of come with it. I mean, a lot of the times the abilities, you might not necessarily even notice on some of these weapons. Like as somebody who has played like 400 hours of FF7 Remake, probably another 300 hours of Rebirth, I cannot for the life tell you like what abilities come on all of these weapons. Also, what about the combat mechanics that have gotten left behind and don't carry over between installments? What about stuff like Melee Barret, right? Presumably you have to cut out Melee Barret in Remake since Rebirth doesn't have Melee Barret, and I presume Part 3 is not going to have him either. What about all of the intermission stuff with Yuffie and Sonon? I mean, that's an entirely separate system from everything else in the Remake series at this point. So what, you have to like go back and make it consistent? Because having a different combat system for like a couple hours of gameplay would be really, really bizarre if you're trying to create a perfectly seamless experience. And then that becomes its own can of worms. There's also the weirdness of like chapter select in a game this long that I feel like, given the game being this long, they would have to, like inexcusably have to, give you access to chapter select upon you starting the game and then completing chapters, rather than just giving it to you upon completion of like this gigantic monstrosity. There's also kind of the funkiness regarding multiple points of no return in this game, right? There'd be the point of no return when you go off in the boat in Rebirth, and then presumably like one for the whole game for Part 3. But I don't know if it's that weird, because Remake itself had multiple points of no return that you could only really do all the side quests mostly in their respective chapters. And if you want to go do that again, you have to jump back there through chapter select anyways. So having that repeat kind of across the game, but maybe in a bit more of like a nonsensical, inconsistent manner, would be a little weird, but I don't think it would be a huge problem. This also makes me think, how exactly is hard mode going to work? Because hard mode in this release would have to be a fourth entirely separate hard mode. You couldn't just take the hard modes from each of the individual games and stitch them together, because the hard modes are balanced around the fact that you have full access to like your abilities and the full power materia and end game items and stuff like that, which sounds fine, but then that makes you remember, wait a minute, that means that the Shinra grunts that you fight at the reactor at the very beginning of Remake have to deal with all of the crazy nonsense that you have at the very end of part 3. This would mean that this hard mode would be one of the hardest, if not the hardest challenge in all of video games. Having to balance hundreds of hours of content around endgame equipment from the third game in a trilogy means that the difficulty level would have to be so obscenely ridiculously high. But that also kind of assumes that hard mode they would even do for this release. I mean, given how obscenely hard it would probably be to balance around hard mode specifically, I can totally see them just throwing hard mode in the garbage for a version like this, and then just sticking with like dynamic as the hardest difficulty. In fact, it's not even just progression or enemy combat balancing that you'd have to worry about at a massive scale to account for future game mechanics in games that they're not supposed to be in, but also like level geometry itself. They would basically have to like rebuild or expand the size of these levels if you went back to them and chapter selected back into them. Like, I really noticed this a lot in Remake compared to Rebirth. Rebirth, on average, has areas that are like 20 to 30% larger than Remake when we're talking about some of the more linear sections of Rebirth. And that might not seem like a huge difference, but that's really to account for the synergy abilities and like all of like the space that they take up and like how much they move across the combat arena and stuff. That they made the areas larger to compensate for that. Well, if you can just chapter select and go back to Remake, those areas are much smaller, and so you really can't have synergy abilities without that much space. So then you have to really start making like every area in Remake larger, but then that would really mess up the environmental design of a lot of stuff if you have to make everything bigger. However, despite all of that long list of reasons that I just rattled off about why this is such an incredibly hard thing to do, I still think that there's maybe a small possibility it could happen. There's just little bits of these games that just feel a little weird, that feels like it only makes sense if you would just put them together.
Now, yes, everybody talks about how these games go absolutely insane in their final chapters and stuff, but not as many people mention that the penultimate chapter of both of these games have super long dungeons that drag on for a bit too long and have characters that are ostensibly in your party and engaging in dungeon activity like fighting monsters and trying to traverse through it, but are not directly player controlled. Now, one could argue that this similarity is a coincidence, that it's a combination between logical JRPG endgame design where, yeah, obviously you're going to have a big final dungeon before the final boss, plus the way Square Enix is broken up, FF7 story across multiple games, that it just kind of leaves a lot of characters hanging out in the backgrounds of the climaxes of these games. That, of course, this has happened twice by now, but I feel like there's something more to it, you know? For example, I think about Red 13 and Chapter 17 of Remake. In a standalone game, it obviously made sense to not give you a brand new playable character right before the final boss. However, looking back critically on Chapter 17 of Remake, it is not really a particularly strong chapter or a highlight of the game. The pacing is tedious, the enemies can be kind of annoying, it's way too long, but with a full seamless 3-game experience, you could introduce playable Red 13 in Chapter 17, and there's no restraints on that. In fact, I think it would definitely make Chapter 17 much better by giving the player a brand new toy to play with, essentially. But also, a lot of the enemies in that section are kind of like odd and weird, and you have to play around with them in a defensive way rather than much more offensively, which is pretty perfect to match Red 13's playstyle. I could also see a very similar situation happening with Vincent in Part 3. I found it very odd that in Rebirth, they wrote in Vincent doing off-screen stuff in the Temple of the Ancients in Chapter 13, and he's deliberately like behind the party following you the entire time. They could have written this any way that they could have wanted. They could have written that he was like distracting Shinra or fighting Shinra that was trying to come into the temple so the party could get in and just fight the existing forces. Or they could even just have him sit it out like Sid.
I know I came with you all this far, but I ain't about to go in there.
But no, they specifically wrote it that he's in the same location but off doing his own thing. But then he's not involved in the final battle stuff in Chapter 14? Weird. The main reason why I think combining all these games into one large game might not seem as far-fetched as some people might think is just the simplest way that I could explain how I think this mega game could go down possibly is sort of a Smash 4 to Smash Ultimate kind of deal. Smash Brothers for Wii U and 3DS, for the average player, I think they were like pretty happy with the game. When the idea of Smash Brothers coming to the Switch, I think a lot of people were just really happy with the idea that, hey, let's just port like Smash 4 onto the Switch, get it off the dead console, and just put like maybe a new character or two in it, and then that's that. We'd be perfectly happy. But the game's director, Masahiro Sakurai, made Smash Ultimate instead, that he basically used it to challenge himself and then accomplish multiple victory laps over and over and over again. I've seen how much the development team for these games has progressed and just the amount of crazy stuff that they have been able to do, just achieve things that people weren't thought possible and just go beyond their expectations. I mean, it wasn't even that long ago, relatively, that people thought the idea of a 7 remake was just inherently impossible to do with all of the expectations on it, but it succeeded. Would combining all of these games together be an absolute logistical and balancing nightmare for the development team to handle? Absolutely. But, you know, I think they would actually be up to the challenge by the time that they finish Part 3.
Anyways, if you liked the content of this video, hit like, subscribe if you want more videos about FF7 Rebirth or other various topics. Comment down below, did you like the concept of this video? Did you not like the concept? What other ways can you break the idea of an FF7 remake mega game combining all of the parts together? Hit up my Patreon down in the description below just so you can compensate me so I can make more content like this in the future. Anyways, guys, that's it. And have a good day.